At the divorce hearing, my husband looked proud. "You will never touch my money again," Julian sneered, his voice a low, rehearsed blade. Beside him, his mistress smirked. "That is right, sweetheart." Even his mother, Evelyn, leaned in with a cold, predatory smile. "She does not deserve a cent." The judge opened my letter, scanned the pages, and then laughed hard. He said quietly, "Oh, this is good." Suddenly, their faces turned pale. Julian's smug posture shattered as the judge looked at me with genuine, terrifying respect. The courtroom smelled of stale coffee and expensive wood. Light from the high windows caught the dust motes dancing between us. Julian gripped his mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. He thought I was still the quiet shadow he had spent years erasing. He didn't know I had spent every midnight, for months, tracing his hidden offshore transfers. My hands were steady on my lap, fingers interlaced, hiding the faint pulse of adrenaline. The judge flipped to the second page. Julian's expensive lawyer finally stopped shuffling his papers. A heavy silence settled over the room like a physical weight. The mistress shifted in her seat, her pearls clicking against her silk dress. She glanced at Julian, seeking a reassurance that was no longer there. I watched her realization dawn. I had included more than just bank statements in that envelope. I had included the private messages she sent to Evelyn about their laundering scheme. The judge's laughter had vanished, replaced by a sharp, judicial hunger. He adjusted his glasses and stared directly at Julian's mother. Evelyn's hand flew to her throat, her diamonds catching the fluorescent glare. She had always prided herself on being the architect of the family legacy. She looked like a cornered animal in a designer suit. The judge cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small chamber. He asked the bailiff to secure the doors. Julian tried to stand, but his own attorney pulled him back down. The power in the room had shifted. It was no longer about a marriage. It was about a crime. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowed behind thin frames. He spoke about federal reporting requirements and the specific statutes Julian had ignored. My husband's arrogance was replaced by a frantic, sweating desperation. He looked at me, pleading for the first time in a decade. I met his gaze with a blank, frozen expression. I had learned to be a mirror, reflecting only what he wanted to see until the trap was set. Now, the mirror was broken. He saw the truth, but it was far too late. Federal agents entered through the back of the courtroom, their boots heavy on the carpet. They didn't go to the judge. They walked straight toward Julian and his mother. I stood up slowly, smoothing my gray dress with a calm precision. The mistress began to sob, a shrill sound that broke the last of the dignity in the room. I walked past their table without a single word. My name was finally my own again. As I reached the door, I heard the first click of the metal handcuffs. The cold hallway air tasted like iron and rain. I walked toward the exit, ignoring the muffled shouts behind the heavy oak doors. My objective was simple. I reached my car before the reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. My phone vibrated with a frantic sequence of alerts from Julian's primary lawyer. He was begging for a settlement conference before the formal arrest processing began. I deleted the messages without reading them. I had spent 3 years settling for less. Now, I wanted everything. Outside, the gray Nashville sky threatened a downpour. I hurried toward the parking garage, my heels clicking a rapid rhythm against the damp concrete. A black sedan blocked my path near the elevator bank. The window slid down to reveal Evelyn's personal driver, a man who had helped track my movements for years. He didn't look aggressive, only exhausted and defeated. He handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope through the gap. It was addressed to me in Evelyn's sharp, distinctive handwriting. I stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The driver didn't speak a word as he shifted the car into gear and pulled away. I ripped the seal open with trembling fingers. Inside was a single key to a safety deposit box, and a list of names. These weren't just business associates, they were high-ranking local officials Julian had bribed. Evelyn was trying to buy my silence. Even as she was being led away in handcuffs, she still thought I had a price. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the third level. The mirrors reflected a woman I barely recognized. My eyes were sharp, devoid of the hollow fear that once defined them. I looked at the list of names again. If I handed this over to the federal agents, Julian would never see the sun. If I kept it, I had leverage over half the city. The choice felt like a heavy, cold weight. I reached my car and sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling. My laptop sat on the passenger side, glowing with the forensic data I had compiled. The primary obstacle was no longer Julian's ego. It was the sheer scale of the corruption he had touched. A new realization hit me as I scrolled through the digital files. Julian hadn't just been laundering his own money. He was holding funds for someone much more dangerous than a real estate tycoon. A sudden rap on the window made me gasp. It was Marlon, my former student and lead investigator. He looked pale, his tie loosened at the collar. He didn't ask for the envelope in my hand. He simply told me that Julian's mistress had just disappeared from the holding room. She hadn't been processed with the others. A secret door in the courthouse basement had been left unsecured. The woman who knew all the passwords was gone. The game was expanding. I looked at the key Evelyn had sent me. It didn't belong to a bank in Tennessee. The small engraving on the brass neck indicated a branch in Panama. Julian wasn't the only one with an exit strategy. I realized then that the mistress hadn't just fled from justice. She had fled with the final piece of the digital ledger. If she reached that box before I did, the evidence would vanish forever. My victory was suddenly a race against a ghost. Marlon leaned against the car frame, his breath visible in the damp air. We need that mistress, Destiny. She is the only one who can authenticate the Panama server logs. I gripped the brass key until it bit into my palm. My objective was now clear. I had to find Claire before she reached the airport. The rain intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof. I shifted the car into drive, my mind racing through Julian's known safe houses. The traffic near the courthouse was a snarled mess of sirens and black umbrellas. Every second felt like a minute lost. Marlon followed in his unmarked SUV, providing a thin sense of security. I remembered a small apartment Julian had purchased under a corporate alias last spring. It was located in a quiet cul-de-sac near the river. He had called it a guest suite. I knew better. It was a tactical backup for his most sensitive and illegal transactions. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. My phone buzzed with a restricted caller ID. I answered, hearing only the sound of heavy breathing and wind. "I have the ledger, Destiny," Claire whispered, her voice trembling with a cocktail of fear and spite. "Julian told me you were too weak to finish this. He was wrong about you." She hung up before I could reply. The signal had originated near the river district. She was already there. I swerved through a yellow light, the tires splashing through deep puddles. The river district was a maze of converted warehouses and luxury lofts. I pulled into the hidden driveway of the guest suite, my headlights cutting through the gloom. Claire's silver coupe was parked haphazardly near the entrance, the driver's door still slightly ajar. She wasn't trying to hide anymore. She was desperate. I grabbed my bag and stepped into the cold, biting rain. The lobby smelled of fresh paint and expensive citrus. I bypassed the elevator and took the stairs, my lungs burning with the effort. On the third floor, I found the door to Unit 302 cracked open. I entered slowly, my heels muffled by the thick carpet. Claire was standing by the window, clutching a laptop to her chest. She looked fragile, stripped of the polished confidence she wore in court. "He's coming for us both," she said, staring at the street. I moved closer, extending my hand for the device. "Give it to me, Claire. The FBI can protect you." She laughed. A jagged sound that lacked any real mirth. She showed me the screen, which displayed a live countdown timer. It wasn't a data transfer. It was a remote wipe command initiated from Julian's lawyer's office. He was burning the evidence from the inside out. My heart sank as the percentage bar climbed toward completion. The proof was dying. I lunged for the laptop, but Claire pulled back, her eyes wide with a new terror. She pointed toward the hallway mirror. Behind us, the reflection showed a small, blinking red light hidden inside a smoke detector. It wasn't just a wipe. It was a tracking beacon. Julian hadn't sent the mistress to hide. He had used her as bait to bring the ledger and me to the same room. A heavy lock clicked shut in the hallway. We were trapped. The mechanical click of the deadbolt resonated through the silent loft. Claire dropped the laptop, her face losing the last of its color. "He knew you would follow me," she whispered. My objective changed instantly. I had to bypass the remote wipe and get us out before Julian's cleanup crew arrived. I grabbed the laptop from the floor, my fingers flying across the keys. The countdown was at 40%. I needed a hardline connection to stop the deletion. I spotted a network port near the baseboard. I dragged Claire toward the desk, ignoring her quiet sobs. Pressure mounted as a heavy vehicle idled in the alleyway below. I fumbled with a patch cable from my bag, clicking it into place. The screen flickered. A new window popped up, requesting a biometric override. Julian had encrypted the final layer with his own thumbprint. I looked at the brass key Evelyn had sent me. It was useless here. Suddenly, the apartment's smart lighting dimmed to a deep, ominous red. The central air kicked off, leaving the room eerily still. I realized Julian wasn't just erasing data, he was controlling the entire environment. I turned to Claire, grabbing her shoulders. "Think. Did he ever use your prints for secondary access?" She shook her head frantically. "No, but he used his mother's." My breath hitched. Evelyn wasn't just a silent partner. She was the primary fail, safe for the entire network. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the list of names Evelyn had provided. At the very bottom, written in tiny script, was a series of alphanumeric characters. It wasn't just a list of bribes. It was a recovery sequence. I typed the code into the biometric override box. The progress bar for the wipe froze at 98%. The red lights flashed once and returned to a soft white. I had stopped the destruction with seconds to spare. The laptop screen turned bright blue as the encrypted files finally opened. Thousands of transactions flooded the view, revealing the true scope of the laundering. Julian hadn't just been working for local officials. He was the hub for an international syndicate. My hands began to shake as I saw the latest entry. It was a transfer to a private security firm. The payment was for a containment and extraction. At our current address. They were already inside the building. I heard the heavy thud of boots on the stairs. Marlon wasn't answering his radio, likely blocked by the same jammer Julian used to secure the perimeter. The silence from the hallway was more terrifying than the shouting in court. I shoved the laptop into my bag and grabbed Claire's hand. We couldn't go back the way we came. I looked at the window leading to the fire escape. The rain was slicking the metal, making it a treacherous path. "We move now?" I commanded. Claire nodded, her fear finally turning into resolve. We scrambled through the window just as the apartment door was kicked off its hinges. Cold rain lashed against my skin as we descended the metal stairs. Below us, a man in a dark tactical vest looked up. He wasn't one of Marlon's agents. He raised a suppressed weapon, aiming directly at the laptop bag strapped to my chest. I realized then that they didn't want the data. They wanted it destroyed along with the only person who could explain it. I ducked behind a rusted dumpster as the first shot shattered a nearby window. My objective was simply get the laptop, and Claire to Marlin's SUV. The shooter moved with a professional, lethal efficiency that Julian's usual thugs lacked. Rain slicked my palms, making it hard to grip the heavy bag. I signaled for Claire to stay low against the brick wall. We were pinned between the alley exit and the armed recovery team. The air felt electric with danger. Claire pulled a small, silver canister from her pocket. Julian gave me this for protection. She whispered, her eyes wide. It wasn't pepper spray. It was a high-grade smoke grenade used by private security. I grabbed it, feeling the cold weight of the metal. If I could create a screen, we could reach the street. I pulled the pin and tossed it toward the shooter. Thick, gray fog billowed out, swallowing the narrow alleyway in seconds. We ran toward the light. We burst onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath. The street was strangely empty. The usual traffic diverted by a city work crew. Marlin's SUV was nowhere in sight. I checked my phone, but the signal was dead. Julian had deployed a local jammer to isolate us. I realized then that the work crew at the end of the block wasn't city employees. They were wearing the same tactical vests as the man on the fire escape. We were boxed in. A white van skidded to a halt 10 feet away. The side door slid open, but it wasn't the tactical team. Marlin leaned out, holding a service weapon. "Get in now," he yelled over the roar of the rain. We dove into the back just as bullets sparked against the van's reinforced plating. The driver floored it, the tires screaming against the asphalt. We were safe for a moment, but Marlin looked terrified. He wasn't looking at the shooters behind us. He was staring at the laptop screen in my lap. The recovery sequence I typed earlier had unlocked more than just bank files. It had triggered a silent alert to the international syndicate Julian served. They now knew exactly who held their secrets. Marlin explained that the containment order didn't come from Julian's lawyer. It came from the very officials on Evelyn's list. The people meant to protect us were the ones funding our execution. The stakes had reached a peak. I looked at the brass key again, noticing a small inscription on the side. It was a set of coordinates for a private airfield. Evelyn hadn't just given me a list of names. She had given me an escape route. She knew Julian was a dead man walking. She was trying to save herself by sending me to the one place the syndicate couldn't reach. But to get there, I had to trust the woman who helped ruin my life. The van took a sharp turn, nearly throwing us from our seats. Marlin's phone suddenly chirped, bypassing the jammer through an encrypted federal channel. The message was short and chilling. Julian had been released from custody on a technicality 10 minutes ago. His lawyer had argued that the initial search warrant for the Foundation records was improperly filed. He was no longer in a cell, he was on the hunt. The judge's laughter in court felt like a distant, cruel memory. My husband was free, and he knew exactly where we were heading next. The van tires screamed as Marlin took a corner on 2 wheels. My objective was to reach the airfield before Julian cut us off. The city lights blurred into a streak of neon and gray rain. Marlin's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he checked his mirrors. He knew the federal channel was no longer secure. Every officer in the city might be looking for this specific white van now. We were running out of paved road and time. Claire gripped the laptop like a life preserver in a storm. She whispered that the GPS coordinates lead to an old private strip near the Cumberland River. It was a place Julian used for midnight shipments of luxury goods and untraceable cash. Pressure mounted as a black SUV appeared in the rearview mirror, its high beams blinding us. It didn't have police markings, but it moved with aggressive, lethal intent. The hunter had found his prey. We were less than 5 miles away. Marlin swerved into a construction zone to lose our shadow. Barrels flew as the van clipped a concrete barrier, sending a jolt through my spine. I checked the brass key again, noticing a small electronic chip embedded in the head. It wasn't just a physical key, it was a short-range transponder for the hangar doors. If we didn't get close enough, the hangar would stay sealed. The SUV rammed our rear bumper, the metal crunching with a sickening, heavy thud. The van fishtailed. But Marlon regained control with a grunt of effort. I realized the SUV wasn't trying to stop us. They were pushing us toward a specific bridge. I looked at the dashboard map and saw the trap unfolding in real time. The bridge was closed for repairs, creating a perfect bottleneck for an ambush. I shouted for Marlon to take the dirt path instead. He hesitated, then yanked the wheel hard to the right. We bounced into the dark. Mud sprayed against the windows, obscuring the world outside. The van groaned as it navigated the uneven, saturated terrain. I looked at the laptop and saw a new window popping up. It was a live video feed from the airfield hangar. Julian was already there, standing under a single floodlight with a phone to his ear. He wasn't waiting to escape. He was waiting for the ledger to arrive so he could burn it personally. The power balance shifted again. We broke through a line of trees and saw the runway. The SUV was nowhere to be seen, but the silence was more terrifying. Marlon killed the headlights and coasted toward the dark silhouette of Hangar 7. I held the brass key toward the windshield, hoping the transponder still worked after the crash. A low hum vibrated through the air as the massive steel doors began to slide open. We were inside, but we were not alone in the shadows. Julian stepped out from behind a stack of crates, his suit perfectly pressed despite the chaos. He didn't look like a man who had just been in a cell. He looked like a king reclaiming a lost throne. "You always had a flair for the dramatic, Destiny," he said softly. His voice carried no anger, only a chilling, quiet disappointment. He held a small remote detonator in his left hand. It was wired to the fuel tanks of the plane. Though I knew he was too narcissistic to actually blow himself up, I stepped out of the van, holding the laptop bag high. "The data is already mirrored to a secondary server, Julian." It was a lie, but it was the only leverage I had left. He smiled. A slow and genuine expression that made my skin crawl. He knew my tells too well after a decade of marriage. He pointed to the ceiling, where several red lasers converged on my chest. His cleanup crew was already in the rafters, waiting for the signal. Marlon shifted in the driver's seat, reaching for his weapon, but I signaled him to stop. Any sudden movement would end in a bloodbath. The red dots danced on my skin, but Julian held his hand up, wanting the physical ledger more than my blood. I walked toward Julian, the brass key cold in my hand. I offered him the laptop in exchange for Claire and Marlon's safety. He hesitated, his greed warring with his need for total control. The hangar smelled of jet fuel and old secrets. He reached for the bag, his fingers brushing against my trembling hand. As he took the weight of the laptop, I pressed the transponder button 3 times in rapid succession. This wasn't the door command. It was the emergency fire suppression override. A massive cloud of chemical foam exploded from the ceiling, blinding everyone in the room. In the white chaos, I heard Julian scream in rage. I grabbed Claire's arm and ran toward the back exit. But as we reached the door, a muffled pop echoed through the mist, and I felt a sharp, burning sting in my shoulder. The chemical foam tasted like bitter salt and static. I stumbled through the white haze, my objective fixed on the emergency exit at the rear of the hangar. The burning in my shoulder radiated down my arm, a hot needle of pain that threatened to numb my grip on the door handle. Claire was a frantic ghost beside me, her hand clutched into the fabric of my coat. Behind us, the foam muffled the sounds of Julian's men coughing and stumbling over heavy crates. The heavy steel exit door was jammed from the outside. I threw my weight against it, but the metal wouldn't budge. Pressure mounted as the hiss of the fire suppression system began to taper off. Through the thinning mist, I saw the silhouette of a man moving with slow, deliberate precision. It wasn't Julian. It was the shooter from the fire escape, his tactical vest white with residue. He raised his suppressed pistol again. I pulled Claire behind a stack of rusted oil drums. I looked at the wound in my shoulder. The bullet had grazed the muscle, tearing through my dress but missing the bone. I realized I hadn't just brought a key to this fight. I had brought the truth. And the truth was currently sitting in Julian's hands. If he opened that laptop, the override I had set would trigger a remote data broadcast to every major news outlet in the state. I hadn't stopped the wipe. I had redirected the entire payload. Julian's voice boomed through the hangar, amplified by the building's intercom system. "You think you are clever, Destiny. But you've just signed everyone's death warrant." He sounded closer now, his footsteps echoing on the wet concrete floor. I checked the transponder on the brass key once more. There was a second button hidden under a sliding panel. I slid it back, revealing a small red toggle. It wasn't for a door or a plane. It was an emergency signal for the local river patrol. I flipped the toggle and felt a faint vibration in the key's casing. The power balance shifted as sirens began to wail in the far distance. Julian heard them too. He stopped moving, his shadow frozen against the hangar wall. I whispered to Claire to stay down and never let go of the drums. I stepped out into the open, my hands raised to show I was unarmed. My shoulder screamed in protest, but I kept my eyes fixed on Julian. He was standing by the plane, the laptop open in his left hand. The screen reflected a bright, neon green light as the broadcast sequence began its final countdown. Julian looked at the display, his brow furrowed in sudden, genuine confusion. He didn't understand why the files were vanishing into the cloud instead of deleting. I smiled through the pain. "It is not a wipe, Julian. It's a confession." The green light turned a solid, triumphant gold. The large hangar doors began to creak open as the river patrol arrived at the dock. Blue and red lights flooded the space, reflecting off the white foam like a strobe light. The tactical shooter lowered his weapon, realizing the odds had finally turned against his employers. Julian lunged for the plane's cockpit, desperate to ignite the engines and flee into the dark sky. But the fuel lines were still coated in thick, slick foam. The engine sputtered once and died. Marlin appeared from the side of the van, his weapon leveled at the cockpit. "It is over, Julian!" "Get out of the plane." Julian didn't move for a long moment. He sat in the pilot's seat, staring at the laptop that had just destroyed his life. He looked at me through the windshield, his face a mask of pure, concentrated hatred. He finally raised his hands, the remote detonator falling uselessly to the floor. I felt a sudden, massive wave of relief. The federal agents swarmed the hangar, their voices sharp and commanding. They secured Julian and his team with professional speed. Marlin ran toward me, his face etched with worry as he saw the blood on my shoulder. I leaned against him, the adrenaline finally starting to fade. Claire was already being wrapped in a blanket by a female officer. The air smelled of rain and victory. I had kept my promise to myself. I had finally rewritten the ending. As they led Julian past me, he stopped for a split second. He leaned in, his voice a ragged whisper that only I could hear. "You think this is the end? You haven't seen the other names on that list." He was taken away before I could respond. I looked down at the brass key in my hand. The small red light was still blinking. Tiny beacon in the dark. I realized then that the list wasn't just evidence. It was a map. The ambulance lights bathed the hangar in a pulsing, rhythmic blue. I sat on the rear bumper of a medic's truck, my objective fixed on finally letting go. The burning in my shoulder had faded into a dull, heavy throb. Julian was gone, tucked inside a federal transport vehicle that hummed with a finality he couldn't escape. Marlin stood nearby, watching the agents bag the brass key and the laptop. The storm outside had slowed to a soft, persistent drizzle. A medic wrapped a pressure bandage around my arm, the white gauze staining pink. I looked at the river, realizing the other names Julian mentioned were already being processed. My broadcast had reached the right desks before his lawyers could block it. The pressure of the last decade lifted, leaving me strangely light. I watched the mist rise off the Cumberland, feeling the cold air settle into my lungs. My life was finally my own, free from his shadow. The primary obstacle now was the inheritance of the case of left behind. As a legal spouse, the cleanup of his legitimate estate would fall to me. I had to decide whether to salvage the family name or bury it. Evelyn's list was a map of debt and deceit that extended far beyond Tennessee. I realized then that my forensic skills were more than a memory. They were my future. I would turn his stolen wealth into a shield for others. I reached into my pocket and found the Target gift card I had kept for months. It was the same one Evelyn gave me to mock my poverty. I handed it to Marlon with a tired, faint smile. "Buy the team some coffee," I said softly. He took it, his eyes reflecting a deep, quiet understanding of the irony. The power dynamic had inverted completely. I was no longer the woman who asked for permission. I was the one who provided. The dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple. I stood up, refusing the medic's offer of a ride to the hospital. I wanted to drive my own car, to feel the steering wheel beneath my own hands. Claire approached me, her face clean of tears but filled with a new, sharp uncertainty. She asked if we were ever truly safe. I looked at the river and told her that safety is a choice. I walked to my car and turned the key, the engine purring with a steady, reliable force. A new notification appeared on my phone, sent from an anonymous, encrypted source. It was a photo of the safety deposit box in Panama, already opened by an unknown hand. The mistress had fled, but she hadn't taken the money. She had left a single, handwritten note inside the empty vault. It simply read, "Now we are even." The game wasn't over yet. I knew the shadow in Panama was just the first piece of a much larger puzzle.